How's it going, guys? I'm Theo Joe, and today I'm going to tackle the age-old question, iOS versus Android. And obviously I'm going to tell you right off the bat, there's no definitive answer for which is better, but I do have extensive experience with both. You know, my first smartphone was back in the day, the iPhone 3GS. I used iOS for about 4 years, then switched to Android, used that exclusively for 4 years. And recently I got the iPhone 8 Plus and have been using that for the past month. So it kind of refreshed my memory, and I think now I'm in a good position to really give my experience in the main differences between iOS and Android and the advantages and disadvantages of both, because there are significant advantages to both, even though they have gotten a lot similar in performance recently in the past couple years. There are some things that are pretty different and will depend on what you prefer. So how this is going to work is, first I'll go over the advantages of iOS, and that in turn kind of goes over the disadvantages of Android, and then we'll go over the advantages of Android, and then we can draw a couple conclusions. Alright, so advantages for iOS. We can start off with one of the main things that I envied so much after I'd switched to Android, and that is how easy it is to upgrade, restore, and back up your phone with iPhone. With iOS, it's all under Apple's whole ecosystem, so it's all very controlled, very consistent, which means that you can back up your phone as is and it will work on the next phone. That just doesn't work with Android because there's so many varieties of phones and manufacturers. With iOS, you back up your phone, when you go to restore it, whether it's on the same phone or an upgraded phone, you're gonna have all your passwords, all your settings, all your apps. You don't have to change anything. It's as if you transferred a carbon copy from the old version to the new version, and it will all work. That doesn't work on Android, like I just said. Yeah, you can back up and restore the same apps, but a lot of times you're gonna have to type in the same password. You're gonna have to change all your settings back to how they were. You have to log into everything. It's a huge pain, and it's even more so if you're going between manufacturers, like from LG to Samsung or the Google Pixel. And here's another problem. If you're on Android and you have a phone that has the latest version, such as 8.0 with the Google Pixel, and you want to change to a phone that maybe has a slower update schedule. So if you have an 8.0 phone and maybe a newer phone even comes out but it has an older version of Android, you can't restore your old data onto your new phone because it has an older version of Android. So it's a mess really upgrading and restoring Android. None of that happens with iOS. It's so easy. All right, the next advantage has to do with iMessage, which is a far superior messaging platform than just regular SMS, as you probably know if you've ever used it. Now, with iMessage, it only really works between two iOS devices. If you're messaging someone who's not on iOS, then it sends as regular SMS, but a lot of people do use iPhone, so you can use it pretty extensively. And with iMessage, you can do a lot of stuff. You can send your location and it pops up on Google Maps right in the message. I noticed you can send videos and images a lot easier, whereas SMS has these arbitrary size limits depending on your carrier, and sometimes it doesn't even work at all and it doesn't tell you. iMessage is clearly just superior in every way, and you're not going to get that on Android until they come up with something like the Google's RCS, which is what they're developing, but that is a long ways off. All right, so here's another iOS advantage that doesn't really have to do with the software, and that is that typically the best, newest apps really always come out on iOS first. Usually with startups that develop really innovative stuff are always developing in iOS before on Android. And a lot of AAA companies, you know, releasing AAA A+ apps that are top tier, you know, you never see them release exclusively on Android before iOS. It does happen, but it's very rare. And we can get into that more later, but typically the reason is that it's easier to develop on iOS because there's less variables to consider. With iOS, you know that there's a very small number of phones, whereas if you go to Android, there's so many phones by so many manufacturers, there's so many different release schedules for updates that you have to cover so many bases, whereas on iOS, you know that most people update to the latest version, and there's only a handful of phones that they might be using, a handful of resolutions to test on. So it makes sense to go on iOS first, wring out all the wrinkles, and then go to Android. And for those same reasons, I found that apps on iOS are typically more polished. They perform better because, like I just said, there's less phones variety to accommodate, whereas on Android, if you go to develop on one type of phone manufacturer, it might not behave the same as another manufacturer. So apps, I have noticed, do work smoother on iOS in general. Now, here's another big advantage of iOS is that you don't have to wait around for updates. If there's an update that gets pushed out by Apple, you can install it unless your phone is really, really old. Whereas on Android, if there's a brand new update like Android 8.0 Oreo, some phones, even made within the last year, may never get that update, either because the manufacturers never made it for that specific phone, or the carriers take forever to push it out, which I think is ridiculous. Me personally, one of the reasons I really like the Pixel phones and the ones made by Google is that if there is an update, you can get it right away. You don't have to worry about being at the mercy of any manufacturer or cell carrier. On iOS, you know you're gonna get that no matter what phone you get. Here's an advantage having to do with the App Store, and that is, it's kind of a double-edged sword. We can get into that later as well. But the App Store for iTunes is much more restrictive than it is on the Google Play Store. So you're gonna get a lot less junk, garbage apps, and specifically malware apps on iOS because Apple keeps that thing locked down. They're very picky about what they add, whereas on Google Play, they barely, I don't even think they review apps at all. They kind of do an antivirus scan that's general, but I don't think anyone hand reviews any apps on the Google Play Store. So one advantage we can say is that the Google Play Store does have more apps, more variety, because it's easier to get on there, but the quality is lower. So going back to iOS, you're gonna be more secure because the security of the apps themselves are more robust because Apple is hand-picking them. Now, the next thing kind of having to do with apps is that you're not gonna get any bloatware on iPhones. Apple is a behemoth in the tech industry, and they're not gonna let carriers push them around and make them put their crappy bloatware and tech support apps and DirecTV garbage on there that you're never gonna use. Whereas on Android devices, unless you buy it unlocked and for no carrier, you're almost guaranteed to get some sort of garbage apps that you're never gonna use. You have to sift through the settings to figure out how to disable them if you can at all. So I really like that about iPhone as well. So we got a couple more for iOS, and the next one is that I've noticed third-party companies and services typically support Apple and iOS devices before they support Android. Maybe not that much earlier, but it does happen. So for example, Apple Pay, I think personally that a lot of stores are gonna support Apple Pay before they support Android Pay because they know that iOS users are probably gonna use that service more than Android users are gonna use Android Pay, which you almost never hear about, even though there are more Android users total. And it might be counterintuitive. I know, yes, lots more people use Android than iOS, but for whatever reason, Apple just has a reputation where it's like, well, if we're gonna support smartphones, we gotta do iOS, we gotta do iPhone, just because when you think smartphone, you think iPhone, and I guess that's just how companies think. If they're gonna support one, it's gonna be iPhone. All right, so finally for iOS advantages, for my list at least, I know there's more that you guys are gonna get mad that I didn't mention, but anyway, this last one is that Apple has way better support than Android. It just blows Android out of the water, and in my opinion, that's because Apple, at its core, is a consumer electronics company. They're all about the customer and selling devices, whereas Google, they have a lot of different stuff they're doing. Mostly their ad services generates a lot of money, and Google has a reputation, deserved, I think, that they don't care about the customer. I genuinely believe that Google does not give a crap about their customers. You can disagree with me, and I love Google and their services, but I really don't think they care about me as a customer. I'm just gonna say it. Whereas Apple, you can walk into an Apple store. When's the last time you walked into an Android store to get support and had someone come up to you and say, hey, can we help you out with that? no charge. With iOS, if you go in and there's an issue and it's under warranty, they don't really ask many questions. If it is clearly something that's wrong with the phone, they just replace your phone, and going back to the ease of upgrading, like I said before, it's not a problem. Because on Android, if you have a problem with the phone, yeah, it might be under warranty, but you're gonna have to go to whatever manufacturer made the phone, hope they have the same policies for replacing it, and then the best case scenario, you're gonna have to send it over the mail and wait and get a new one. Whereas you don't have to do any of that with Apple. Now, all that being said, Android has a lot of very big advantages as well. Number one being widgets. This is something I don't know why Apple has not put into iPhones yet, because they're so useful. So on Android, if you're not aware, I hope you are, you can put widgets from different apps that developers can make right on your home screen among the other app icons. And they can show real-time information, whether it's the weather or your calendar or your notes or anything from, your stock portfolio just on your home screen, and it updates, or can be something as simple as a shortcut that you press and it does an action within each app. So you can't do that with iPhone. Yeah, they have the thing where you swipe left and it shows a whole menu of some widgets, but those are very limited that I've noticed. So kind of tying in with that, another huge advantage of Android is just general customization that it affords you. So you're allowed to change default apps. You can't change the default map app, for God's sake, on iOS. You have to use Apple Maps. You can use Google, but you have to go into it manually, and you can't have other apps open into Google Maps. You can also change things like even the default text message app. So when you receive a text message, if you don't like the interface of Apple's messaging app, you have to use it, whereas on Android, you can use something like Textra, which I think is much better, has much more features, and you can just do whatever you want. Even things like the lock screen you can customize on Android and have widgets and things appear on there, and even the launcher, the home screen itself, the entire skin of the phone can be changed on Android. If you don't like the Google Now launcher, you can use like the Nova launcher or whatever. So it's just so much more customizable. If you have something that you want your phone to be able to do or look like, you can do it on Android, whereas if it's on iOS, you just have to get used to it. All right, this next advantage for Android isn't exactly on every phone, I know, but it is on most, so I thought I'd include it, and that is a lot of phones have LED notification lights. iPhones do not have LED notification lights at all. And they are something that I think is so useful. I don't know why Apple doesn't just put in a little tiny notification light that can change colors so you can glance over at your phone and see, well, I have a notification from a text message that, oh yeah, let me look at that. Whereas if it's a blinking notification for email, it's like, well, I don't really care about that. You can let it go. It's just so useful. It can convey so much information simply from the color of the light, and it's a small little light. You know if you have any notifications at all and which one it is, instead of having to pick up the phone, tap on the home screen, or whatever. Okay, the next advantage for Android is something you might not think about that often, but is something I've really noticed, and that is that apps on Android have much better system integration with the phone as a whole than do on iOS. On iOS, apps are really locked down. They're very limited in what they can do in the background, which is kind of like a double-edged sword because it uses less battery. But on Android, you can do things like having a fake GPS location, whereas on iOS, apps will absolutely not have that permission. On Android, you can have screen overlays, things that might pop up, and like such as the Twilight app that kind of dims the screen and overlays a color to have better eyesight at night. You can't do that on iOS. They absolutely have no control over the screen. Even things as simple as running tasks scheduled in the background. So for example, on Android, I have an app called Mr. Number, which downloads a list of spam numbers and will block them on your phone. And it will also display who the caller ID is based on the spam list and can actually block phone numbers altogether and tell you this is a spam call. Where on iOS, you have to manually open up the app every time, every day that you want to update that list of spam callers. Now, you could argue this improves battery life because things can't go in the background, or that it's more secure, and those things are true, but I just wish that you had the option to allow more permissions on certain apps so that you can just have more apps that do more cool things like you do on Android. Next up, having to do with notifications. The Android notification system is so much better than iOS. I love the Android notification systems, and I didn't realize how much I loved it until I went to iOS, which has the dumbest notification systems imaginable. So here's what I'm talking about. On Android, it's just natural. So you get a notification, it shows a little icon at the top, so you know, okay, I have a notification from this app, you know to check it, and when you swipe down, it shows more details about each notification. You can just swipe across to get rid of them if you don't want to see it anymore. On iOS, first of all, there's no grouped notifications, which means that if you are on an iPhone and you're in a group chat where people are particularly talkative and are sending messages one by one, second after second, or you're in a chat program like Steam, it's gonna show you an individual notification for every single message. It will not group them, which pushes down any other notifications that you might think are important. I don't know about you, but I don't need to see every single message. I'm not gonna be reading through an entire text message conversation from the notifications panel. I'm gonna go into the app to do that. I just need to see, oh wow, there's 10 messages in this group chat. I better go look to see what it is. So, and also, that means you also have to swipe away and clear each notification individually, whereas on Android, you can just do it all at once. And strange enough, apparently iOS used to have the ability to group notifications and they took it away. Apple, that is the stupidest thing I've ever heard in a while since you removed the fingerprint sensor. It's almost as stupid as that. So Android notifications, a million times better. All right, the next one is very simple, and that is that Google Assistant is just better than Siri. And that's because Google has really been putting a ton of effort into artificial intelligence, whereas I think Apple has kind of let it stagnate. They're a little bit behind. And what I mean by this is the Google Assistant is much better at understanding average conversational speaking. You can give a command a lot of different ways, and it can interpret that how you mean it. Whereas I found on Siri, if it can even do that command, then you do have to give it in a correct way of speaking, whereas on Android, you don't have to worry about that as much. The next plus for Android doesn't have to do with the operating system, but rather the phones themselves, and that is that Android is more affordable. And I don't necessarily mean each individual phone, because yes, there are flagship phones that are just as expensive as iPhones, but if you are on a budget, I think that you can get a really good Android phone, whereas if you want to spend less than like 500 bucks, you're gonna have to get an iPhone that's a couple years old, whereas there are budget manufacturers for Android phones that do really good jobs. And kind of just going off that, there are way more devices on Android to choose from, whereas with iOS, you know, you're kind of stuck with what Apple wants to give you, and the features are pretty much the same between them. Maybe every year they introduce a little new something, but the variety on Android is huge. So maybe you want one with dual cameras, maybe you want one that's waterproof. Now most of them are these days, but you get the idea. Maybe you want one with wireless charging, or you don't care about wireless charging, you'd rather have a big battery. Maybe you don't care what the phone looks like, you don't care if it's super ugly, you just want that huge battery. There's some for that too. All right, next, I found that Android accessories are a lot cheaper than iPhone accessories. So for example, if you want a charging cable, you know, Android uses USB, USB-C, it's all universal. So there's a lot of manufacturers that make really quality official products. You know, if you buy a charging cable from LG or Samsung or even Google directly, you know you're gonna get a quality product. And since they're competing, not any of them are gonna be really expensive. Whereas if you wanna go buy an official iPhone charger, you're gonna pay through the nose for it. Whereas if you wanna get a third-party one, then those manufacturers have to charge a little bit more because they have to pay a royalty to Apple for every Lightning port that they want to use, for example. They have to pay for every single one that they make something to Apple, which raises the price. And they also have to go get it certified and all this, and that all costs money. And yeah, you know you're gonna get something quality that is an advantage if you know it's been tested, whereas you don't have to deal with any of that nonsense on Android. If you just buy from a reputable manufacturer, it's universal, it's gonna be cheap. All right, kind of getting back into the software, I like that on Android you have a little bit more fine control over the processes that are running than on iOS. So on Android, you can actually force stop applications. Whereas on iOS, yeah, you can swipe it away, but did you know that doesn't actually end the program from running? It doesn't. On Android, you can actually force stop it. Also on Android, you can do things like clear the cache, clear the data of each individual app, and see how much it's using up. A lot of that is just, you can't do it at all on iPhone. All right, now finally has to do with the home buttons. Obviously they look very different, and I like that Android has 3 buttons to choose from with different functions. There's the regular home button in the middle, the circle, there's the app switcher, and the back button. All very clear, very simple, whereas on iOS, you know, it's just the home button. If you press the home button, it goes back to home, and if you want to go back, you have to go and look for and hope that an app has a back button in there. I mean, it's not bad on iOS, it's just easier on Android. All right, so those are the advantages of both that I most noticed. Why don't we draw a quick conclusion? I'm not gonna go over everything again. And that is, which one should you get? And in general, I would say if you are not a tech enthusiast who really wants to dig down into the settings to get everything exactly right, then I definitely think that iOS and iPhone are better for you. If you don't want to have to worry about anything, especially dealing with support, iPhone is way more user-friendly. It's easier to get going, especially for people who don't really deal with technology a lot or aren't super familiar with it. If you are a tech enthusiast, well then you don't need me to tell you which one you want to go with. You can probably make that decision on your own. But I will say that if you're a tech enthusiast who really has a very specific way they want everything to be, then you can't beat Android in terms of customization. And yeah, I know you can jailbreak your iPhone, but it's not really that ideal. Sometimes it's difficult to do or it doesn't work that well. And you know, that voids your warranty. You have to force yourself to be behind a few updates. It's kind of a pain. So those are just my thoughts. I'm not gonna obviously say which is better because I don't think there is one that is necessarily better definitively. I'm using iPhone right now. Maybe a couple months from now, I'll decide I wanna go back to Android. Who knows? I'll probably end up using both over time and switch between them. So yeah, that's it. You guys can let me know what you think down in the comments section. If you want to keep watching, I've got some other videos right here you can check out. You can just click on those. And if you want to subscribe, I make a few videos every week, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, so it should be worth it. And also consider enabling notifications, or YouTube literally might not show you the new videos at all. The algorithm is not that great. So again, I'm looking forward to hearing from you guys. As usual, thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Have a good one.